Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our session on faculty and graduate employees' voice in campus responses to the COVID-19 crisis, a domestic perspective. We have three distinguished panelists with us today. Rebecca Given is going to talk about experience at Rutgers University, where she's an associate professor and director of the Center on Health and Work, something like that. Sorry, I lost track of my notes. We also have Amir Fleischman from the University of Michigan Graduate Employees Organization. And finally, Paul Clark, speaking from his perspective as longtime director of the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State University, where he's also served on the faculty senate for many years and had to experience the COVID crisis without union representation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Rebecca. I believe she's first on our list to tell us about Rutgers University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Paul, for really coordinating this session. This is, I live and breathe this every day. I'm the vice president of our Union of Faculty, Grad Workers, and Counselors, which is Rutgers AUP AFT. We are jointly affiliated with AUP and AFT, which I think gives us a lot of strength. It's nice to see some of our members here in the session. They can hopefully keep me honest or say if the rank and file perspective is the same as my my perspective. And there's so much to say on this, so I'll just try to focus on a few highlights and then we'll see where we go. But I can't help but plant a few things that maybe we can return to in the Q&A. One thing is when you're in one of the larger academic unions in the country, you hear from a lot of people and a lot of exciting work that's going on that's not necessarily on the panel, but might be in the audience. One is the organizing often through AAUP chapters at private universities without bargaining rights and without much experience of organizing. Over the course of the pandemic, I've heard from a lot of faculty, especially at private campuses, from liberal arts colleges to large universities. And then the other thing is faculty without bargaining rights who are doing a sort of minority union wall-to-wall model in usually the United Campus Workers CWA affiliate. So that was already going on in some places, especially SEC schools, Tennessee and Georgia. And then Arizona went bold and big with a United Campus Workers chapter, especially in response to some pretty draconian furloughs that were proposed and they successfully pushed back on. So those are my sort of things that I'm not going to cover, but I'd love for people to want to talk about, I guess, my points. So let me say a few things about, our campus and our union. I mentioned we represent full-time faculty, tenure track and non-tenure track, grad workers, and some counselors. Our part-time lecturers, we call them our adjunct faculty, are organized under a different union chapter and bargaining unit. They have their own leadership, but we work very, very closely with them, which I think is, really crucial in the contemporary university. Our university at Rutgers, our bargaining units are more or less statewide. So New Brunswick, Camden, and Newark, along with a health sciences unit that is mostly with the schools that were part of a merger, a big biomedical sciences merger into Rutgers. And we have roughly 24 bargaining units of about 12, a little more, different international unions. So some international unions have multiple bargaining units at Rutgers. It's a sort of complex array. And we have about 20,000 of the 30,000 Rutgers employees are union represented. So that's kind of the lay of the land. And we're old. So our faculty bargaining unit is celebrating our 50th year. So we're right behind Wisconsin. I don't know if any Wisconsin veterans are on here, but we're the second oldest in the US. So when the pandemic hit, I think, many of us sort of see three sequential, maybe, crises or challenges. The first one was the health and safety one. We're in a global pandemic. The second one was the finance/austerity/neoliberal opportunity crisis, which many of us experienced. And then the third one, I guess we're calling the racial reckoning, but a belated focus. You could call it lip service, you could call it deep commitment, you could call it anywhere in between, by universities, but also unions and individuals and many people thinking about structural and systemic racism and how they affected us. So, and I'll say a little bit about how that played out. So for us, the health and safety crisis, we immediately, like everybody, I guess maybe like everybody, turned to keeping our members safe. So we had immediate health and safety concerns. In our case, the issue was our libraries. The university wanted, they were very concerned that they might have to refund tuition with going to remote. So they had to maintain this appearance of we are open. And one decision that was made was the libraries must be physically in person, open. And so our library faculty and staff were being told they had to come in person to work during, this is like mid-March 2020. So really scary times when we didn't know if, you could get COVID from touching a surface that had been contaminated 3 days earlier, right? And they were being told, come to work. And so we leapt into action then, and we started to work very, very closely with this whole coalition of Rutgers unions, so all the different bargaining units. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And the university wasn't budging, so we started to think about what collective action we could threaten, but ultimately we worked with our political allies and got an executive order from the governor's office to shut down the libraries, which shouldn't have been necessary, but did the job. So once we got all our members safe, then we moved to the mode of university anticipating massive cuts. And so we have the sort of financial crisis that emerged, and that many see this as sort of an opportunity to accelerate many of the trends that had already been happening in universities. And so we quickly coalesced as a coalition and said, we want a people-centered approach. I'll put a little Chronicle piece that I wrote on that people-centered approach. You may have to get your free Chronicle account or log in to read it. But basically, we as a coalition came together and said, our goals here are to protect the vulnerable. We want to make sure that you don't use this as an opportunity to lay off the most vulnerable workers, whether those are adjunct faculty or Black and Brown dining hall workers. We had a strong contrast because in the state of New Jersey, they were able to survive the whole financial anxiety time period only through furloughs, no layoffs. And yet Rutgers immediately laid off about 1,000 workers and instituted a hiring freeze on adjuncts, which said that programs couldn't rehire to their previous levels. So we had a huge crisis, but we very quickly came together and said, those of us who are the most privileged, which I think, tenured faculty are willing to sacrifice. And so we put the voices of the workers that were really, really at great risk front and center of our demands. And we said, we want no more layoffs. We want adequate PPE. We were still fighting for adequate PPE. We have a lot of healthcare workers. And we want a people-centered approach to the crisis. So that's kind of how we approached it. To say a little bit about the sort of structural racism piece, which came, I would just say belatedly, but in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. For us, although I'm sure that influenced our thinking in myriad ways, we had been trying to center racial justice in our work for many years, including in our previous bargaining campaign and including in much of the bargaining for the common good work that we do. We already had a longstanding campaign around the destruction by a Rutgers medical unit of an elementary school serving primarily Mexican immigrant students from mixed status family. That was a very successful community school that was slated to be bulldozed because of a Rutgers entity. So we were thinking a lot about racial justice before, and I would say we, I'm sure, thought differently about it, but that wasn't something that we had never thought about before. We had done both internally and externally a lot to center racial justice demands, including sort of around pay equity. I could really get into the weeds, and with a LERA audience, unlike some other groups I talk to, you guys would probably be into it and have a lot to say about it, but I don't want to take up all the time. So let me say a couple things about where we ended up. So in May of 2020, we proposed entering into a work sharing program. Work sharing is, as most people think of it as German, because that's where it's used more than anywhere else, but also known as short time compensation, where basically the employer furloughs the employees for part of the time, and the balance of the paycheck is picked up by the government. And it's a way to keep people employed, right? It's great for a pandemic. I realized when reading about the LA Times negotiation of a program like this, that it works very well when it's union negotiated, and that certain states, including the state of New Jersey, have enabling legislation that makes this possible. And with the federal unemployment insurance supplement, it meant that many of our members could be kept whole, or indeed more than whole, through the unemployment insurance system. So this was a great opportunity. When we proposed this in May, we could have said to the university that was pleading poverty and pleading, we can't use our unrestricted reserve there, that's for a rainy day, but not this rainy day, all the same kind of stuff. What we proposed would have saved the university between $100 and $150 million. And it was kind of time limited because of the federal unemployment insurance supplement. It was much harder to keep our members whole when that supplement wasn't in place. So we proposed that the university really couldn't get their act together. I brought it to the union, to the coalition. The coalition decided to propose it. The university was not able to get their heads around it and understand how it might work. And we didn't reach an agreement on that, although they did impose a work sharing program on non-represented workers. So our deans and others were in such a program when we weren't. In our contract, so many of our coalition siblings were laid off, and we went big and we went public to fight this. Our contract doesn't give the university much wiggle room. We can't be laid off. The one thing the university can do is withhold our raises. So we had a July 1st raise scheduled, but because of past, let's say, ugliness under the Chris Christie administration and before, we have had negotiated a clause that said, in order to withhold our raise, the university has to declare that a fiscal emergency exists, and we can grieve that declaration and take it to arbitration, in which case there'll be a hearing and an arbitrator, a neutral, I won't name her, but she's in the contract and many of you know her. She's an accomplished arbitrator, will actually say this is or is not an emergency, a fiscal emergency. And if it's not, then we'll get our raises back. So we, sure enough, they declared the fiscal emergency. We grieved it and started the arbitration process. And on and off through that process, we were in settlement negotiations to call off the fiscal emergency and reach an agreement that would work for everyone. Faculty were very clear that we would defer our raises as long as we got no more layoffs, lift the adjunct faculty hiring freeze, and funding extensions for our grad workers who, as you guys know, and there may be grads on here, were horribly disrupted by the pandemic, and the chances of completing their degree on the original timeline were, practically zero. So I won't go into all the details, but I will say it took until about May of this year March of this year to reach an agreement. I'll put the highlights of the agreement in the chat. You can get into it, and for all my shout out to my collective bargaining nerds, you can read, there's a link to the MOA there. But basically what's great about our agreement, one is that as a coalition, we signed an agreement. So in the past, the university had not accepted that we were a coalition. They said, you're a bunch of disparate bargaining units. We signed the agreement as a coalition. We also massively expanded the scope of bargaining. So even though the lifting of the adjunct hiring freeze isn't technically in that, in that MOA that you can see, we negotiated it at the same time as part of the same package. And we said, we need this, we can't sign off on something without it. We also got the graduate extensions, which were clearly beyond any sort of narrowly technically defined scope of bargaining. We got those as part of this bargaining agreement. We got our raises reinstated. So instead of being canceled indefinitely, they were deferred. And then we did enter a work share program. And if you want a good time, have a bunch of tenured and distinguished faculty tangling with a state unemployment insurance system. That's one of the things we've been spending a lot of time on. But we're really, really proud of our members being willing to engage in a work sharing program, voted massively to ratify this tentative agreement, because they understood that in order to protect the vulnerable and do what was best for our values and for the mission of the university, this was something absolutely essential and was the best path forward. And so I can say a lot more. And Tammy mentioned we actually have, we were one of the first places to negotiate not just an extension for tenure track faculty members by 1 year early in the pandemic, but as we realized how long remote teaching and the inability to do your research was dragging on, a second year for those tenure track faculty who clearly wouldn't be able to hit their markers on the same timeline. So I'll stop there, but thank you all. And I'm excited to hear what Amir and Paul have to say.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was very interesting. As you may know, we have a faculty union at Florida State, and we've been doing a lot of the same kinds of negotiating, but I'm not on this panel, so I'm going to turn things over to Amir. And Amir is going to tell us about the University of Michigan. He's the co-chair of the contract committee. Is that right?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Amir. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the political science department at UM. For last year, I was the secretary of GEO 3550, and I'm currently one of the contract committee co-chairs. So I'm going to take this time to tell sort of the story of our strike, how we were able to pull it off, or the extent we were able to pull it off, and what the effects have been on our union and our university. So just a bit of context, during the 2019-2020 school year, we were doing our normal contract bargaining. We had a really ambitious campaign with demands related to housing, climate change, very substantial cost of living adjustment, benefit increases, and racial justice demands. But our escalation campaign was scheduled to peak in April 2020. So you can all probably imagine how that went. We really lost all of our energy due to COVID. And we ended up basically having to settle for a mediocre contract with meager raises and without any of our sort of marquee social justice demands. But as the extent of the pandemic became clear, we set up a COVID caucus, which was a group of rank and file members who really became the beating heart of the efforts that would culminate in our strike in September. To get us to the point where we were strike ready, COVID Caucus surveyed our members to understand how they were experiencing the pandemic and how it was affecting their ability to work. And based on that survey, COVID Caucus generated a list of demands with special attention paid to the needs of parents and international students. We wrote an open letter with a list of demands, and through a concerted organizing effort, we got over 1,800 signatures for the demands. And also, collected email addresses and began organizing people. Over the summer, we met with deans and administrators, and it really went nowhere very quickly. It really just showed us they were not willing to hear us out and had their own idea for how the reopening would go without really caring what we did. So we started escalating a bit. We had car and bike rallies, we had in-person protests, we began holding more frequent all-members meetings throughout the summer, and we began collecting strike pledges. This was a huge effort, made more difficult by the pandemic. We spent hundreds of hours of phone banking, and it's a lot easier for a member to just ignore a call from an unknown number than it is for them to ignore you when you're showing up at their office. There was also a lot of disagreement within the leadership over how to read the results of the various structured tests we had. And this resulted in us being a lot less prepared than we could have been when the strike came. And of course, this was all happening in the context of the George Floyd protests. And demands related to policing were among those we failed to win in the previous contract campaign. So during a general members meeting in July, a rank and file member asked that we include policing demands in our platform. These demands proved very controversial, but were a critical component of our strike. They had to be developed on a short timeline, and I think we ultimately failed to consult our African-American members to the extent that we should have. But nonetheless, there was a clear connection between our COVID safety demands and our anti-policing demands. The boss made this connection really clear for us by enforcing their COVID safety protocols with increased policing on campus. This included the so-called Michigan Ambassador Vigilante program, which empowered students and community members to police other students, often in conjunction with armed cops. So by the start of the school year, it had become clear that the university's reopening plans were really unacceptable, irresponsible, and untenable. At a meeting of the Faculty Senate, it became clear to everybody how widespread the opposition was to the university's reopening plan, and that sort of made everybody in the union leadership realize we needed to strike. We were one of the few organized bodies on campus capable of standing up to the administration. Undergrads and faculty were looking to us for leadership. So when we voted to strike, our demands included unconditional remote work option, better and more flexible childcare subsidy, more support for international students, a 50% reduction in the campus COPS budget, funded timeline extensions for all grad students, and more testing capacity on campus, among other things. The universal remote option was one of our central demands and one of the things our members wanted the most. In the sort of impact bargaining we'd been doing over the summer, the university offered us a week process to grieve unsafe classroom conditions. Our bargaining team was pushing for membership to accept this at the meeting where we were going to vote on whether to strike. But thanks to the work of the grassroots COVID caucus, our members rejected this lowball offer and moved to strike. Our strike authorization ballot ended up passing with 80% of the vote for a week-long strike with an option to renew. So we sprung into action, organizing picket shifts, communications, coordination, online picket shifts, etc. We picketed construction sites, hoping that the building trades would respect our lines. This was really important because shutting down construction sites hurt the boss's bottom line more than us not crossing the line. But it was also difficult because the trades weren't always sympathetic to our policing demands, and they had to sacrifice their own pay if they weren't going to go on the job. We did manage to shut them down on several days of the strike, but had to be strategic about how many times we were asking people not to go to work. While this was going on, other groups on campus began joining the strike. Residents, advisors, RAs also went on strike over the incredibly unsafe conditions they were being subjected to. And dining employees facing threats from the administration started planning job actions. Of course, COVID was running wild on campus. Students were being put into subpar quarantine housing, often without access to hot meals or laundry. The School of Music, Theater, and Dance, which had the most in-person classes of any section of campus, had to close because 10% of their students got infected. There was no hand sanitizer stations in most campus buildings, and according to the university, exposure to an infected person in a classroom was not sufficient to warrant a COVID test. With all that going on, there were no outbreaks connected to our pickets, which had strict COVID safety protocols and a lot of PPE. We received outpouring of support from the community from across the country, from labor unions from coast to coast, from national politicians tweeting in support of us, but to be honest, very little from national AFT. We received a lowball offer from the administration that did not meet many of our key demands. No increase in testing, no universal remote option, no police budget cuts. Once again, the bargaining team recommended we take the offer, really just believing what the administration was telling us, that this would be an exploding offer and that we wouldn't have a chance at something better if we rejected it. After a really contentious general members meeting, the offer was rejected by our members and the strike was reauthorized for another week. But at the beginning of the second week, the university started legal proceedings against us. The strike was doubly illegal, both in violation of our no strike clause and in violation of the state ban on education workers striking. So we really had no chance to win in court. It's also important to note that when the university decided to take legal action to bust our union, this was at a time when 7 out of 8 of the members of the governing board of regents were Democrats. These regents are elected by statewide office, but they were still willing to crush labor on campus. And again, we found that AFT National and the State Democratic Party were of little help bringing pressure to bear on these regents. And even as the Faculty Senate for the first time in university history voted no confidence in the university president, GEO members could do little but accept the university's final offer before the injunction would take effect. Ultimately, we won more flexible childcare funding for parents, better support for international students, and arbitration over unsafe in-person work. And even though we only won a toothless task force on policing, we had forced the boss to actually negotiate with us on this topic, importantly proving that these issues are labor issues. And thanks to the work of our undergraduate allies and the Students of Color Liberation Front, the so-called Michigan Ambassador Vigilante Program, which I mentioned earlier, was abolished. In the following weeks, the full impact of the university's bungled reopening plans became clear. COVID outbreaks were occurring across campus, and things were so bad that the county actually had to intervene and issue a stay-at-home order for Michigan students. Many of the demands we didn't win were quietly adopted by the administration in the following months. We got increased testing capacity, the university ended up going fully remote, and we won sort of a patchwork of timeline extensions for graduate students. So even though we didn't win many of our key demands, the strike was still a success for a number of reasons. First, we spat in the boss's eye, got away with it, and none of our members were sanctioned and all legal action was dropped. After more than a decade without striking, we showed our members that this was the way to make our voices heard. We shattered the prevailing wisdom that merely threatening a one-day job action would get us wins at the bargaining table. And we made it so that GEO will now be far more prepared to strike during our next contract campaign. Our actions also exposed the callousness of the administration and really energized our members. Another piece of prevailing wisdom that the strike disproved was that having radical demands would cause us to hemorrhage members. In fact, at the end of our strike, our membership rate was at the highest it had been since right to work became law in Michigan. We also forced the university to the table on policing issues, which in itself was quite an achievement and hopefully, a stepping stone to a bigger victory in a couple of years. The strike for Safe Campus was a result of grassroots organizing by our members and has really permanently changed the face of our union. It showed us to be a leader on campus and has greatly increased our profile in the local activist community and really heightened our member militancy and showed everybody what a powerful force we could be. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Amir. Very interesting. Okay, I guess our next panelist, Paul, is still here, and he's going to tell us about the situation at Penn State.
Yes. Before I start, I'd just like to say, well done, Amir. Great work out there at the U of M. Well, we've heard about the voice that employees represented by unions have had at their, in terms of their university's responses to the COVID crisis. I'm going to talk about the development of COVID-related policies at a large state university where faculty are not represented by a union. Penn State is a land-grant university with 100,000 students, 24 campuses. Our flagship campus at University Park has 46,000 students and 3,000 full-time faculty. We're a very big place. I have been here a very long time. And I would characterize the university as a very centralized top-down institution. University leadership and top administration are traditional in their approach to leadership. They're conservative, they're hierarchical, and they're risk averse. They embrace a command and control style of management. Important decisions are made and communicated down the chain of command. And not surprisingly, there's a well-developed institutional bureaucracy that has grown up in the service of this style of administration. And it challenges anything that departs from the established orthodoxy. Penn State has one union that represents about 2,500 maintenance, physical plant, grounds, and housing and food service workers, but the faculty and the graduate students are not represented by a union. Faculty governance at Penn State, such as it is, occurs via an elected faculty senate. I was a member of that senate for quite a few years. A recent chair of the Senate said the best word he could conjure up to describe its role historically was supine. It's a consultative body with the ability to make policy only on academic issues, including curriculum. However, the university regularly makes decisions without significant consultation with the Senate in other areas. Sometimes administrators seem to think that alerting the Senate leadership to policy changes before they are announced constitutes consultation. There have been a number of instances in recent years, however, where the faculty Senate has challenged university decisions and in some instances brought about some very positive and significant change. So that's hopeful. This brings us to the COVID crisis. The university spent the summer of 2020 planning for the coming academic year. They formed 16 committees and task forces. Incidentally, that is the Penn State way. However, the committees were made up largely of administrators and staff. Of 250 task group members, only 16 were faculty, and many of those were faculty also working at administrative positions like department heads and deans. The university came out with their plan to reopen the university, and it was met by significant faculty opposition. One criticism was that the plan was unrealistic and out of touch with the realities of pedagogy, something faculty attributed to the fact that classroom teachers had very little voice in the process. A faculty activist group called the Coalition for a Just University at Penn State organized a group of faculty from the colleges of engineering and science to do its own epidemiology study, which projected significantly more students would become ill than the university model projected. It also quickly organized a statement asking for greater transparency and more faculty involvement, more student involvement in the decisions involving the reopening of the university. And that was signed by 1,100 faculty and nearly 500 graduate students, staff, and other members of the Penn State community. The university responded with its usual modus operandi. It refused to respond or even acknowledge the faculty study or the statement. Now, while many universities plans to reopen for fall 2020, sort of peers of Penn State, including Cornell, Purdue, and the University of Illinois, while their plans tested all students, faculty, and staff prior to or upon arrival on campus, Penn State's plan only tested around 30% of all students, faculty, and staff prior to arrival. This was one of the reasons for the great concern on the part of faculty. And once on campus, the University of Illinois tested every one of its roughly 35,000 undergraduate students for COVID-19 twice a week. And Rutgers required weekly testing of any Rutgers community member who was living, working, or learning on campus. By contrast, Penn State approach was to do random testing of 1% of the population each day, which means that each person was tested on average once every 100 days. Now, as it turns out, Penn State's top-down approach to COVID hasn't been a great success. It's quite the opposite. In terms of COVID cases identified by the university as of May 26th, Penn State was in the top 5 of all universities nationally with 7,700 cases. As I understand it, based on a New York Times report, Rutgers had a total of 1,938 cases, and Illinois had 6,766. These are at their main campuses. So in terms of per capita cases, 16.7% of Penn State students contracted COVID, compared to only 3.69% at Rutgers and 12.9% at Illinois. We also had very high rates in the community, certainly related to the rates on campus. Penn State's administration unilaterally made other top-down decisions during the COVID crisis that were problematic. These problems, again, might have been avoided with greater faculty and student input. One example, a few days before the fall 2020 semester, Penn State issued a decree that all students were required to sign a waiver before beginning classes. And here's the language in the waiver. I assume any and all risk of exposure to COVID-19 that may result from attending Penn State or participating in Penn State activities. And I acknowledge that exposure or infection may result in personal injury, illness, permanent disability, or death. Not surprisingly, many students balked at signing such a waiver. And in the face of immediate criticism from students, faculty, and legal experts, the university quickly reversed course and provided an alternative legal agreement that students had to sign regarding the coronavirus before returning to campus. But many of us believe strongly that if the university had just involved faculty in writing this waiver, we would have immediately raised red flags and saved the university the trouble and the embarrassment of having to back down. As we contemplate a return to relatively normal circumstances in the fall of 2021, many of Penn State's peer universities have already announced that they will require returning students to be vaccinated before coming to campus. This includes the University of Maryland and Michigan and Indiana University and Rutgers, I believe. Penn State has said it will not do this. Rather, it will rely on a lottery with prizes of gift certificates to the university bookstore. Well, we'll see how much of an incentive that proves to be. Again, this has resulted in significant faculty and grad student discontent, as demonstrated by the immediate criticism of the policy by the faculty activist group I mentioned earlier, and the passage of a resolution by the faculty senate by a 113 to 31 vote that all students should be required to have the vaccine before returning to campus. Now, as I mentioned, I've been at Penn State a very long time, and I'm not anti-administration. In fact, I served as school director for 20 years. That's basically a middle management position. And for the most part, I really think that Penn State's administration tries very hard to do the right thing, but they have a blind spot. And that blind spot is that they cannot truly look at all these decisions, all the potential policies from the perspective of the on the ground, in the classroom faculty member, not to mention the perspectives of other employees and of students. And that causes them to regularly make problematic decisions that they sometimes have to walk back. And the way to correct this blind spot, in my opinion, is not hard. It involves being more open to true faculty participation in decisions in all areas. And what's perplexed me for decades is the university's sheer fear of doing this. This fear blinds them to the fact that shared decision-making usually leads to better decisions than solely top-down decisions, or even decisions involving minimal or pro forma consultation. And that when you involve faculty in the decision-making process, they feel that they have some stake in the decisions that are made because they were part of the process of making them. And they'll work with the university to implement decisions rather than working against them. And the other thing the university fails to recognize is that voice is a constant and universal desire on the parts of employees. Evidence of that here is simply the creation of this faculty activist group that is really one of the few entities where employees can exercise voice. So that's the situation at Penn State. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Another very interesting presentation. We still have some time in our session. If people would like to ask some questions of our panelists or make a comment. Johanna, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much, Becky and Paul and Amir for your presentations, and congrats, Amir, for that great struggle. Comment first, like from the Canadian context, I think the impression of the pandemic from the start was perhaps less dire. And so we generally saw less of the real knee-jerk austerity. And we obviously had a government system that was more supportive in terms of broad lockdowns and things like that too. But, really interesting, but maybe disheartening to commiserate on the fact that still the administrations were not very good at collaborative and transparent decision making. I do have a specific question for Becky around the work sharing program, and I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly. And so in the Canadian context, we had a wage subsidy program that our federal government put in place that basically said, if employers kept people on the payroll, they would pay something like 25%, and then the feds would supplement that for the remainder. Is that similar, or am I not getting that correctly? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. You're exactly right, only I could just dream about our program being administered in the way yours is. And I'll say a little, and this also responds to Tammy's question in the written chat too. So that's exactly right. These work sharing programs are also known as short time compensation, as essentially gives the employer the opportunity to furlough the employees for a percentage of the time and have government make up for the difference in the paycheck or a high percentage of the difference. There may be some, and it's, used in some Western European countries, including just, through economic dips, not necessarily a pandemic. And the challenge, and this gets into Tammy's question about member support and educating the unit, is that I think in every state where there's enabling legislation in the US, it's administered through the unemployment insurance system. So we had to say to our members, some of whom are, we have tenured faculty who've been on the faculty for 50 years, tenured for over 40. You need to go online, file in the New Jersey Department of Labor unemployment insurance system, which you've been reading every day for the past year, is a sort of nightmare of, hung up calls and hold times and all of that. And file for unemployment. No, you're not unemployed. You are not an unemployed person. We don't mean to challenge your strong identity as an employee or someone with a job, but you need to go through the unemployment insurance system. And we say, as we help, and we really chose to take our members by the hand step by step. We could have just said, we negotiated this is an HR situation, go to University Human Resources. Everybody has the opinion that you might expect from our University Human Resources. I would say on balance, they might be worse than some places. We said, we're not going to do that. We negotiated this and we want to help you through it. We know there's going to be snags with the state unemployment system. We had some connections to the State Department of Labor, so we knew that it would work, but we also knew there would be glitches. And we don't want to send people to, there's something called OneSource, which is kind of the anonymous query system for HR. We won't just sort of drop you in it and maybe you get your money, maybe you don't, maybe you get on hold for 7 hours and so be it. So what we did was we really worked to organize members, and I'll say this, I don't know if I've said this publicly, our legal advice was we might not have even needed to have this agreement ratified. We did not consider that. We needed it to be ratified. And we even, again, you guys know it's very unusual for something to be rejected at ratification. And we phone banked and text banked. We said, we want people to know, we want them to vote, we want them to weigh in, and then we will walk them by the, hold them by the hand and walk them through the unemployment insurance system to make sure that they understand that we asked, especially the full-time faculty, to make a sacrifice, to engage in work sharing for these other goals that we care about, especially for our grads, for our part-time lecturers, and for our staff. And so we held a zillion town halls, I think is the actual count. We did went to department meetings where we were invited. We have a pretty good, not comprehensive department rep structure, and we held many meetings to make sure our reps were very well versed to fan out and talk to their colleagues. This was, the disappointment to us is that Rutgers didn't accept our offer when they could have saved a lot more money and had a lot more, a larger work sharing program that saved a lot more. But we felt like this is something where we're able to live our values and tell Rutgers that, we're willing to take this sacrifice for the goals that we think advance the broad interests of our entire university community.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anybody else with a question?
I just want to say something. I feel like there's opportunities here for cross-university, cross-border solidarity actions. I'm just not sure exactly what that looks like. You guys are talking about voice in terms of the faculty voice in terms of the unions and making these changes, like union voice. We're also doing work in Canada. It's at least at 7 Canadian universities surveying faculty and staff on the impacts of COVID on their work, non-work situations, which is getting fed back to the unions, but it's not totally clear to me right now how they're using that. And not criticizing unions, maybe we're not drawing the points strongly enough and making clear the practical use that kind of research can have. Or, Paul is drawing on stuff that he's read in the New York Times, and I forget the other sources, but just other universities in the US who are having these kind of successes, what kind of pressures could be put, or what kind of actions? When the TAs and the RAs are out on the picket lines at York, and you see like QP National rolling down the street, and everybody, kind of steel workers, the construction workers on campus, the TTC work, like everyone kind of showing up. Is there some kind of equivalent, or is this just a kind of a cute idea, but not going to work at all in practice?
Who would like to take that? Nobody?
I'll say a little bit. I think it's a bit, let's say it's a patchwork. I have been talking to a lot of folks in the US to say, if you don't have a union and if you're somewhere where you don't believe you have bargaining rights, which I might take a different view of bargaining rights and what bargaining is, but go ahead and start an AAUP chapter. And I think, it starts with really person-to-person organizing. So I think, just talking, I've been doing a lot of talking to folks on other campuses, and I think just talking to each other, we took about 100 of our coalition members, rank and file members from across the coalition, went through, Jane McAlevy's been doing with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundations, these online strike schools with several thousand people. It's basically an organizing school, but strike school makes it sound a little more fun. And you go with your group, but you participate in big sessions and then breakouts with your group. And we've been doing that. And so it's great for bringing our members together. That's great, Amir, that you guys are participating. I think it was tremendously beneficial. And for us to do it as a coalition so folks could get to know people in different bargaining units. But then also this international relationship building. So there are academic worker university unions in other countries that are participating in that. And so getting to see what the challenges are for them. I know the UK is the other country that I know the best, and the challenges are really, really similar in terms of the gigification of academic employment, the sort of privatization and outsourcing of support jobs, the degradation of faculty governance. All of those pieces are the same. And I will say we trying to look in the chat as well. We participate, there is a Bargaining for the Common Good Higher Ed Network, which is across faculty and staff unions. Big participation by University of California in that, and there's some good cross-university building in that space as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anybody else like to jump in?
Yeah, I can try to answer
Amir?
that for So I would say that, like, for our strike, it was one of the biggest regrets I have was not coordinating better with the lecturers union so that they also went on strike with us. I think that could have made it a lot more powerful. I think we're starting to see more inter-union cooperation on our campus. We have this all-campus labor council now, which is sort of a body of all the campus unions, including those at the hospital, that has been trying to do more programming together. They've recently been putting on this series of meetings that are called sort of like the People's Regent meetings, and they did this past year sort of a participatory budgeting process to see what more democratic use of the university's endowment would look like. Yeah, I guess, we're also participating in the Jane McAlevey training. It's been great so far. And we're also, we're trying to move more towards a bargaining for the common good model. I think as a grad union, we have some very unique internal problems insofar as, like, our entire membership turns over every 10 years pretty much. And the way GEO structures our leadership also turns over in an even shorter amount of time. But we're working on it. And I think another thing is, like, one of the unions who's least engaged with the cross-union on-campus organizing is AFSCME, who are like the custodians, who, if they went on strike, would have one of the biggest impacts on the university's ability to actually carry out its operations in the short term. With us, it takes a little while for, like, the backlog of grading and teaching to actually reach a crisis point for them. But if the custodians don't show up, the university can't open. So it's about sort of reaching these other places and building solidarity that we're trying to work on.
Johanna.
Thanks. Paul and maybe Becky too, maybe Amir too, on the struggle to have your administration listen to you and take you seriously and become more participative, do you have any advice or ideas about how that could happen? So maybe a more direct question is, Paul, do you think if the groups at Penn State went out on strike, would that move a needle? And for Becky and Amir, do you guys find that your very robust activism and action, do you think that has lasting power, or is it the same struggle every single time?
Yeah, the problem here, unfortunately, is that this is so deep in the DNA of the Penn State culture that it's just incredibly difficult to turn around. And I think one important point to recognize is it starts at the very top, and that's not with the university president, that's with the board of trustees. Penn State has a board of trustees where the business community is actually guaranteed a certain number of spots that I don't know that non-Penn Staters even vote, but my guess is that the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups get together and they decide who's going to be on the board. They need to be Penn State alums. The ag community, which is a relatively conservative community because we're a big agriculture school, also has a certain number of slots on the board. And then more recently, we've seen the remaining at-large spots again being filled by people from the business community. And so this idea of collaboration and engagement is just, something that isn't going to gain any support of the board of trustees. They're perfectly happy with the top-down approach. And another way this manifests itself is really scary for us as faculty is that the board of trustees basically put together we're going to have a search for a new president, put together the search committee and I think there was something like 18 Board of Trustees members, the head of the Alumni Association, one student, and one faculty member. Now, the outcry was so great that they've now added, I think, a second faculty member. But along with this, the message they seem to be sending is, we want the next president to be from the business community. And there's great fear of that. The coalition has already been active. The faculty senate's already voted in opposition to this and asking for more faculty input. The last search committee had 50-50 faculty and trustees. So, I'd like to be optimistic about changing the Penn State DNA, but it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, so I think to answer the question of whether this is transformed into institutional power, I would say not yet. We're in a similar situation where, I mentioned in my presentation, the University of Michigan Board of Regents. We're the only state in the country that this board is elected by a statewide election. So to win one of these votes is like, it takes almost as much organizing work as if we were trying to win one of the US Senate seats in Michigan. Because there are literally millions of people all across the state voting for these positions. And the nomination usually gets handed to major donors in the two political parties. We have, one of the Republicans is this guy, Ron Weiser, who was, very involved in the January 6th insurrection, chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, friend of Trump, horrible person. And then in the Democrats, we have the billionaire owner of the Little Caesars Pizza empire, Denise Illich, right? So it's pretty much the same people, no matter what letter they have next to their name. I guess we were able to win through some organizing work primarily done by the lecturers. We were able to get card check at the university. So we're hoping now to see some more university staff unionization because of that. We recently had the physician assistants unionize at the hospital, which has been good. But I think it's going to take a bit more work. And I think it's going to take sort of a culture shift among the campus unions to be more militant and more willing to strike. And I think our strike is the first step in getting there, but we'll see how it goes in the next few rounds of when the contracts are up. Our lecturers union is negotiating right now, and my understanding is the university is being quite intransigent with them. But if they do end up going on strike, that will be a big shift from where they were 5 years ago. So we're hoping more of that will be happening. We're hoping that if they do go on strike, maybe we'll also go on strike with them. Because there are a lot of serious governance issues at our university, and particularly inequity between the three campuses, with Flint and Dearborn receiving far less money per student than Ann Arbor, despite having a much higher population of students of color and working class students as well.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's all it's all organizing, and you have to organize around these issues. Although political relationships, matter. We have Governor Murphy in New Jersey who followed on the heels of Governor Christie. So you can imagine the contrast in opportunities there. So I think that's really important. Then the other thing I'll say, so our coalition had sort of not really gelled before, but we knew how to get a hold of each other. We had occasional meetings, but the one thing we had succeeded in, and this is, what people have to do if you have multiple unions on the contract, on the campus, we had aligned our contracts. So we all already had common expiration dates. We had some common language. So this fiscal emergency piece was in multiple contracts, and we'll work hard to get more common language as we move forward. But especially aligning the contracts is one of the biggest things you can do to build power. And that was actually the one, clear-cut thing we already had in place going into this.
Okay, we're about out of time, so I think I'm going to call it a wrap, and thank everybody for their presentations and for your interesting questions and scintillating responses. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.